It was Tuesday, 7th of March 1995, and 33-year-old Gerard George Lowe was excited. He'd always wanted to go to Singapore, which was known as a paradise for shoppers, particularly those who liked their gadgets. The taxes were very low, and he knew he would save a lot of money if he bought the latest technology there rather than at home in South Africa. VHS recorders, computers and camcorders were all on his list, and he also wanted a replacement for the hi-fi system he had owned since he was a student. It had all happened very suddenly. He was due to attend a conference in Zimbabwe for his job as a design engineer for a brewery company, but it was cancelled just a few days before, so he had found himself with some unexpected free time, and although he wasn't usually a spontaneous person, he told himself it was now or never. Gerard Lowe wasn't the sort of person to go abroad without at least a little planning, despite the spontaneity of the trip. So he'd written a list of everything he wanted to buy and from which stores. He even knew exactly what they should cost and checked the exchange rates to make sure he was getting the best deal. He was a clever, careful man who was a member of the High IQ Society Mensa, which placed him among the 2% most intelligent people in the world. His first action on arriving at the airport was to use a payphone to call Vanessa, his wife of 2 years. She ran a busy dog grooming salon and was unable to join him on vacation, so he left her a message.
Hi Vanessa, I'm just calling to let you know I'm at the airport. I'll call you once I land in Singapore. It should be 7 a.m. local time, so I think that's about 1 a.m. in South Africa. It's flight number SA282 and it's gonna take 10 hours. Hope everything's alright at home, missing you already. Alright then, bye for now.
He checked in his luggage, a meticulously thought-out combination of a carry-on holdall and an empty black suitcase with some black plastic bags inside. His clothes were in the holdall, and he was planning to use the suitcase to store any electronic items he purchased during his stay, using the black plastic bags as protection from moisture. When Gerard stepped off the plane at Changi International Airport, dressed in an orange t-shirt and beige shorts, he collected his bags and looked around with interest and mild bemusement. He had spent so much time thinking about what he wanted to buy that he hadn't booked a hotel. He was just about to walk up to the information desk when a tall man in his mid-30s approached him with a smile, introducing himself as Simon Davis. His British accent was obvious, and his soft-spoken, well-mannered tone instantly set Gerard at ease. Simon explained that he had been to Singapore several times but was only staying for one night on this occasion. He wondered casually if Gerard would be interested in sharing a hotel room and splitting the cost to save money. It is often said that the eyes are the windows to the soul. When Gerard met the stranger's eyes, he saw nothing there to alarm him, noticing only the look of someone who lived his life by the compass rather than the clock, a stark antithesis to himself. The South African man agreed, feeling nothing but relief to have found a decent, experienced, English-speaking traveller to help him out. After all, there could be no conceivable cause for concern. Singapore was one of the safest and cleanest countries in the world, thanks to its role as a financial powerhouse of Southeast Asia, its investment in the economy and the education system, and perhaps most of all, due to the draconian laws which controlled its population of 4 million and which still attract the attention of human rights organisation Amnesty International today. Anyone caught dropping litter or spitting in public risks a stiff fine, while corporal punishment is dished out for vandals, and anyone committing offences like drug trafficking or murder can expect a mandatory death sentence. In a country like this where violent crime was markedly low, why would Gerard Lowe have any reservations about sharing a room with a stranger? Simon led Gerard to the Riverview Hotel in Havelock Road, a smart, well-appointed high-rise which offered more than 450 rooms and all the modern conveniences that tourists or travelling businessmen would want. They booked room 1511, a twin bed on the 15th floor accessible by elevator and offering views along the Singapore River. The next morning, Gerard's name was removed from the reservation and Simon Davis checked out alone. Back in South Africa, Vanessa Lowe was worried. Her husband had promised to call her when he arrived in Singapore, but she hadn't heard anything from him since the voice message he left at the airport before boarding his plane. She knew Gerard would never have forgotten, and he was so reliable and punctual that something out of his control must have happened. At first, she assumed the flight had been delayed, but she grew more agitated as the hours passed. This was highly out of character for Gerard, and she couldn't even call the hotel as she didn't know where he was staying. She had no choice but to hope there was a simple explanation. Maybe the hotel phone was out of order, or maybe he was enjoying himself in Singapore so much that he really had forgotten to call. She knew Gerard was due back on the 6:45 flight on Saturday 11th of March, so she drove to Johannesburg Airport to collect him as they had previously arranged. As she scanned the crowds for any sign of her husband, standing on tiptoe to see over the wave of humanity swelling through the airport as they boarded and disembarked planes headed for all corners of the globe, her fears returned. She couldn't see him anywhere. She checked with the airport staff whether the flight from Singapore was delayed and was dismayed to be told that it had already arrived and all the passengers had left the plane. Every greeting, every hug, handshake and family reunion taking place all over the airport was like a slap in the face as she continued to wait. After an hour had passed, she knew something was terribly wrong. You could set your watch by Gerard, and he would surely have found a way of contacting her if his plans had changed. In desperation, she filed a missing person report, and his description was fact to the Singapore police. Name: Gerard Lowe. Age: 33. Hair colour: brown, slightly greyed. Height: 5 feet 7 inches. Build: well built. Race: white male. In Singapore on the morning of Monday 13th of March, a man driving a small wooden boat known as a sampan in Clifford Pier Harbour made a grim discovery. The vessel bumped into something floating in the water, and slowing down to get a closer look, he spotted a black rubbish bag emanating a foul smell, tied with a strip of blue cloth. He peered through a small hole in the bag and screamed when he realised he was looking at a pair of human legs. Shaken by his find, the sailor rushed to notify the police, who speedily launched an investigation. Body parts washing up in harbours and waterways was not uncommon due to industrial accidents. In fact, a leg belonging to an Indonesian dockside labourer had washed up just a week before. But in this case, the fact that the legs were hidden inside a bag, secured by a strip of material, which turned out to be from male underwear, made it clear that someone had tried to hide the disembodied limbs. It was likely that the bag had originally sunk to the bottom, but the gases generated through the decomposition process had made it float back up to the surface. A few days later, a human torso and thighs in a similar state of decay were found elsewhere in the water, inside another black bag secured with a strip of clothing. The remains were examined by top pathologist Professor Chow Si Cheng at the Singapore General Hospital. His report stated that the shins and feet had been severed at the knee and belonged to a white male aged between 30 and 40. Each leg weighed around 3.5 kilos, measured 50 centimeters long, and sported fine brown hairs. The torso weighed around 50 kilos and featured some identifying marks, including a scar from an old appendectomy. The dismemberment had taken place after the victim was dead. Whoever had carved up the body had done so with precision, disarticulating the joints from their sockets without damaging the bones, which suggested they could have been a doctor or a butcher. Two questions were uppermost in the minds of the police. First, who was the victim? And second, who was the killer? It wasn't long before they solved the first mystery. Police headquarters had received the missing person report filed by Vanessa Lowe, and they soon connected the dots. A tissue sample from Gerard's sister Terry was sent from a South African lab by priority delivery. It matched tissues taken from the severed legs, helping pathologists to prove that they belonged to Gerard. Now they had identified the victim, they hoped that tracking his movements might help them locate the killer. Police made inquiries and soon found that Gerard Lowe had checked into the Riverview Hotel with a British man named Simon Davis shortly after his arrival at the airport, so they began searching for clues in room 1511. At first glance, the room looked normal, but the unmistakable stench of death thickening in the air indicated that they had found their crime scene. Although the hotel maid hadn't noticed anything wrong at the time, a thorough search turned up fine specks of blood on the wall. One detective laid down on the bathroom floor to get a different perspective and noticed more blood spots on the underside of the toilet bowl. The samples they collected from the hotel room were compared to the tissues sent by Terry, and the results came back with a match. Gerard had unquestionably met his death in room 1511. Investigators set to work tracking down Simon Davis and learned that he had gone to Bangkok, Thailand on a round ticket, which meant he would soon be arriving back in Singapore. When the fugitive touched down at the airport and attempted to get through customs, his passport was flagged and he was detained while the police were summoned. When the officers checked his belongings, they found a deadly arsenal concealed amongst his luggage, including a 10,000-volt stun gun, a blood-stained hammer, several boning knives, a whetstone for sharpening them, 2 pairs of handcuffs, 1 pair of thumb cuffs, and a can of mace. But that wasn't all. Tucked inside a secret pocket was a bundle of passports, 2 British, one's in the name of Simon Davis, and one in the name of John Martin, 2 Canadian passports belonging to Sheila and Darren DeMood, and 1 South African passport belonging to Gerard Lowe. All the passports except for the DeMoods featured pictures of the man they now held in custody. Why was he stealing passports and using them as fake identities? Had the DeMoods also fallen victim to murder? And above all, who was this man? And what was his real name? Singapore detectives contacted Scotland Yard in London, who informed them that there was a criminal called Simon Davis safely in custody in a British prison. However, Davis had at one time shared a cell with a prisoner named John Martin Scripps, who had escaped 6 months ago and fled the country. A photo of him was faxed over to Singapore and they recognised the face straight away. The man in their holding cell was Scripps. His checkered biography slowly came to light and told the tale of a troubled young man who'd grown up to become a recalcitrant offender. He was dangerously well organised and so indifferent to his crimes that he enjoyed a night at the opera after butchering Gerard Lowe's body. Who was Scripps, and what was his story? John Martin Scripps was born in Hertfordshire on 9th of December 1959 to parents Leonard and Jean. John had a sister Janet who was 3 years older. When John was very young, the family moved to London, where Leonard worked as a lorry driver and Jean as a barmaid. Although young John was polite and good-natured, he struggled academically due to his dyslexia and had few friends. When he was 9, his mother left to live with another man, which prompted his father to commit suicide by putting his head in the oven and inhaling toxic fumes from the gas. It was John who discovered the body, and this bereavement under such traumatic circumstances combined with his mother's abandonment was devastating. His schoolwork suffered even more, and he became increasingly withdrawn. He continued to struggle with literacy, but had a creative streak and enjoyed writing poems. After completing his compulsory education and sitting his O-levels, now GCSEs, he left school at 15, which was normal at the time. What wasn't normal, however, was that rather than looking for a job, he embarked instead on a career in housebreaking. Over the following years, he was convicted 4 times for burglary and theft and received several fines, which did little to deter him from the criminal path he had set out on. John used the money he stole to fund trips around the world, which gave him confidence and helped to develop his communication skills. Not limiting himself to the UK, he also began committing crimes overseas. In 1979, at the age of 20, he spent time in an Israeli jail for burglary. A year later, he travelled to Montreal, Canada, where his eventful story continued. There, he fell in love with a 16-year-old Mexican girl called Maria Arianos, for whom he unabashedly wrote love sonnets. He pretended to be a respectable young man working in the import and export business, which was really a euphemism for robbery and fencing stolen goods, but Maria didn't care. The couple eloped to England to marry, and soon Maria gave birth to a daughter, Bella. John made a promise that he would change his ways and become a law-abiding husband and father, but he was unable to keep it. In 1982, he was charged with 40 counts of burglary and for assaulting a police officer during an arrest in Surrey, and was sentenced to 3 years. In contrast with tough Singaporean justice, the British system entitled him to home leave, which meant he was allowed to visit Maria and Bella for 2 days each week, and returned to prison for the other 5 days. On one of these home visits, he took the opportunity to flee the country. He travelled to America and set up a bank account in San Francisco, then visited Southeast Asia. When he returned to England, he was recaptured during a failed burglary and was sentenced to a further 3 years in jail. Disillusioned and disappointed, Maria left him and returned to Mexico. It was around this time that John Martin Scripps had his name legally changed, dropping his father's surname and becoming known simply as John Martin. Despite his propensity for absconding, John was still granted home leave privileges, and in 1985 he once again fled overseas. He seemed to have bad luck with burglaries, so he turned instead to drug smuggling, but it was only a matter of time before he was caught for that too. In 1987 he was arrested at Heathrow Airport, and police officers found a key in his possession which opened a safety deposit box in a Singapore bank. Working closely with the Central Narcotics Bureau in Singapore, the British police were informed that the box contained an enormous amount of heroin, amounting to 1.5 kilos, which had a street value of around $1 million at that time, but significantly more today. Had John Martin been caught in Singapore with these drugs, the automatic punishment would have been execution. After several more years in jail, interspersed with escapes and recapture, John began a 13-year sentence at Mount Prison in Hertfordshire, England, in 1992. For a while he was a model inmate and even learnt butchery under the tuition of an experienced prison caterer, including the art of deboning and disarticulating limbs from animal carcasses. John was a fast learner and very skilled. Apparently he had finally found something he was good at. Although he had not yet completed any of his prison sentences without escaping, He was granted home leave again in 1994, taking with him a birth certificate stolen from cellmate Simon Davis. He sold his possessions, fraudulently obtained a passport under Simon's name, then flew to Mexico to track down his ex-wife Maria. There were few things he genuinely cared about in life, but Maria was one of them, and the anguish he felt when she rejected him and told him she was now living with a policeman was intolerable for John Martin. It was this pivotal moment which set in motion his escalation to murder and determined the course not just of his own life but those of the people who would cross his path. On March 8, 1995, John flew to Singapore and lurked in the hotel lobby, watching people come and go like an arachnid spinning a web to trap its next meal. He approached several well-dressed tourists to propose sharing a hotel room, but they all rejected the idea, until he found Gerard Lowe. The spider had finally found the fly. As soon as the unlikely bedfellows checked in at room 1511 at the Riverview Hotel, Gerard put down his bags and picked up his clipboard to go over his shopping list. Within seconds he was immobilised by a blast from a 10,000 volt stun gun and bludgeoned over the head with John Martin's 1.5 kilo hammer. Just in case he recovered and tried to get free, John handcuffed the motionless man and placed him in the bathtub. While Gerard clung to a rapidly receding thread of consciousness, John forced him to reveal his credit card PIN number. As soon as the information had left his lips, John had no further need for him. He took out a foldable knife, opened the blade with a flourish, and stabbed his victim until he was dead. He then removed Gerard's clothing and dismembered his body in the bathtub using the boning knife and the skills he had learned in prison. The desecration of flesh, blood and bone was concluded within just 15 minutes. John rifled through the dead man's bag and extricated his passport, then began the grisly process of packing the body parts into black trash bags and tying them up with strips of material torn from Gerard's t-shirt and underwear. He placed the bags into Gerard's suitcase, washed the blood off himself and sprayed the hotel room with air freshener to mask the coppery odour of blood. He had one more surgical procedure to complete. He carefully removed Gerard's photo from the South African passport with a pair of tweezers, then with steady hands replaced it with a headshot of himself and painstakingly attached it with glue. He then practiced Gerard's signature, copying it from his credit card and passport. He knew he couldn't replicate it exactly, so he dissolved the original passport signature with solvent and replaced it with his own version. They say there's no rest for the wicked, but John Martin's conscience was deafeningly silent, allowing him to fall asleep on the bed for a while. At around 5 PM he hailed a cab and visited an electronics store at the mall where he inquired about purchasing some laptops. For some reason he told them he would need to think about it, and when the store clerk asked for his name and contact details, he gave Gerard Lowe's name and said he was staying at the Riverview Hotel. Later that night he dined on a succulent steak, washed down with white wine. In the morning, John asked the staff on the front desk to remove Gerard's name from the booking, boldly relating a detailed cock and bull story about his disgust on discovering that Gerard was gay and how he told him to get out of the room. At the time, homosexuality was illegal in Singapore, so the receptionist readily believed his tale. Over the next 24 hours, John went on a spending spree with Gerard Lowe's bank card, withdrawing 8,400 Singapore dollars in cash and purchasing a $500 Thompson branded video recorder which he sent by international post to his sister Janet in England for her birthday. For himself he bought a pair of Iowa speakers for $82 and a pair of shoes for $184. He then spent the evening at the Victoria Concert Hall enjoying the Singapore Symphony Orchestra's performance of Brahms and Tchaikovsky. When he returned to room 1511, he was hit by the odour which had grown stronger in the last few hours, the last traces of air freshener long since faded. He realised he urgently needed to get rid of the body parts, or he would face imminent discovery. The hotel maid had cleaned the room earlier while he was out and noticed a funny smell, but she had put it down to wet clothes and towels drying in the bathroom. The sense of untrammelled serenity that had surrounded him at the concert hall was evaporating, but John was still cool and collected enough to plan his next move. At 5:30 a.m. the next morning, Saturday 11th of March, he dragged the suitcase from the closet. The elevator journey felt excruciatingly slow, as if he were being banished ever downwards through each layer of hell into Dante's Inferno below. To his relief, the elevator kept moving and nobody else got in. He dumped the black bags into the Singapore River, then hid the suitcase elsewhere before returning to the hotel. What he didn't realise was that the security guard had seen him leave and then come back without the case. John Martin's appetite hadn't been affected by the grisly task, and he ate breakfast, then packed Gerard Lowe's clean clothes into his own suitcase to sell later. After checking out, he went to a Thomas Cook office to transfer $8,500 in cash and $5,000 in traveller's checks to the San Francisco bank account he had set up several years before. Finally, he purchased a round plane ticket which would take him to Bangkok, then Phuket, then back to Singapore, believing that this would get him out of the country for long enough to avoid discovery. The day after Gerard Lowe's torso and legs were discovered off Clifford Pier by a sampan sailor, John Martin was en route to Phuket, Thailand. Sitting on the plane 3 rows ahead of him were 2 Canadians, 49-year-old schoolteacher Sheila Damoud and her 23-year-old son Darren. Darren had taken a year out from college to fulfill his lifelong dream of travelling the world, but he had broken his leg in an accident. He was now recovering with a cast and crutches, and his mother had flown out from the family home in British Columbia to vacation with him in Phuket. As they milled around the airport after touchdown, John Martin approached the pair and recommended a good hotel nearby called Nilly's Marina Inn. The trio shared a taxi and booked 2 separate but adjacent rooms. John Martin spent the afternoon in premeditated plotting, even renting a scooter to travel around town and identify the perfect place for body disposal. The following day, he knocked on the Damouds' hotel room door and somehow convinced them to let him in. He produced a stun gun and hammer from behind his back and murdered the mother and son in the same way he had killed Gerard Lowe. With an astonishing degree of composure, he placed a Do Not Disturb sign on the door handle and got to work dismembering their bodies and stealing their credit cards. The remains were packed into black plastic bags like before, their limbs and torsos dumped off a small road just 900 metres from the Marina Inn, and their heads in a disused tin mine in Phuket. It wasn't long before the Damouds' family reported them missing to the Canadian authorities, who contacted the Thai police. The rest of John Martin's journey was already known. After butchering the Damouds, he had flown back to Singapore and been arrested at the Changi airport when his Simon Davis passport was flagged. Around the time he was being interviewed, a dog walker in Phuket made the unpleasant discovery of the severed heads in the mine, prompting international law enforcement agencies to compare notes and coordinate their efforts to reconstruct the horrifying framework of John Martin Scripps' activities. He was charged with 3 murders and was remanded to the Chennai hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The trial began in October 1995. John wore his nonchalance and boredom as casually as his green trousers and grey shirt. His mother and sister had flown out from the UK to support him, and they listened to the gruesome details with sadness and disbelief that the polite, well-mannered young man they had once known could become a killer who had replaced any scruples and human feelings with a strong stomach and a hard heart. John Martin testified that Gerard Lowe had tried to sexually assault him and that he had acted in self-defence and had not intended to kill him. He blamed the desecration and disposal of the corpse on a dangerous friend whom he refused to name, claiming that he was fearful for his family's life. Deputy Public Prosecutor Jennifer Marie called him an inveterate liar and showed the court the defendant's passport forging kit, DNA samples, and evidence from the Fouquet murders to establish the pattern of behaviour. People who had seen or interacted with the defendant during those days before and after the murders were called to give evidence, and CCTV footage showed him withdrawing cash from Gerard's account at an ATM. The self-defence argument didn't fly. The fact he had carried a stun gun, several knives and handcuffs into the country pointed to premeditation. The friend whom John Martin blamed for cutting up the body could not be found. Marie scathingly said, "This British friend, who is supposed to be a big-time drug trafficker, would, the accused would like us to believe, take the trouble to dispose of the body for no apparent reason." 16 days later, John Martin was found guilty and sentenced to death. The judge solemnly read out the traditional fearsome words that people committing capital crimes had heard for hundreds of years in former British colonies where hanging was still in use. "Having been found guilty of the charge of murder, you will be taken from this place to a lawful prison and place of execution, where you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May the Lord have mercy on your soul." The British government chose not to submit a plea for clemency, instead sending a Scotland Yard representative to question John Martin over another murder. He had met 28-year-old British tourist Tim McDowell while scuba diving in Belize, after which Tim had never been seen again. The body parts of a Caucasian man were later fished out of crocodile-infested waters, but there was not enough left to identify him. McDowell's bank account had been drained of $30,000 and the money transferred to an account in San Francisco under the name John Martin Scripps. It seemed that Gerard Lowe had not been Scripps's first victim, but he refused to admit to it or reveal any information. While he waited on death row, John penned his poetic last words. "One day poor, one day rich. Money fills the pain of hunger, but what will fill the emptiness inside? I know that love is beyond me, so do I give myself to God, the God that has betrayed me? Can I be a person again? Only time will tell. You may take my life for what it is worth, but grant those that I love peace and happiness." On 18th of April 1996, 36-year-old John Martin ate his last meal of pizza and hot chocolate and saw his mother Jean and elder sister Janet for the final time. In the early hours of the following morning, he received some words of comfort from a priest and a prison chaplain before he was led out of his cell towards the gallows. The executioner placed a black cloth sack over his head and pulled the lever, thus ending the life of the unhappy child who had grown into a violent, murderous man. He was cremated and his ashes were given to his mother and sister to take back to the UK. Jean told the eager throng of reporters, "How did I not know my own son? We'll never be able to forget what a madman he turned into." Journalist Tanui Boone, who worked for the Straits Times, wrote a book that year called Body Parts, detailing the killer's crimes. The dedication read, "To the men and women of the Singapore police force who keep criminals like John Martin off our streets." One might wonder how such a crime could have happened in one of the world's statistically safest countries, and whether the harsh penalties in Singapore really prevent certain types of murder. Crimes of passion are committed in an instant with no thought to the consequences, and serial killers are frequently unable to stop themselves even when they know they could lose their lives. It's interesting that John Martin chose to kill in countries which carried a mandatory death sentence for murder. Is it possible that he had an unconscious desire for self-destruction? Or was he simply overconfident in his ability to evade justice, relying on his multiple personas and passports to slip from country to country unnoticed? We will never know what caused John Martin Scripps to evolve into a cold-blooded killer. Was it the breakdown of his family life as a child, with his mother's departure and the suicide of his father, topped off by his own marriage ending years later? Was he releasing pent-up anger, abandonment and rejection by killing strangers? Or perhaps he was what many others have been before and since, a cold-blooded homicidal maniac, that perfect storm of nature and nurture colliding. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. There are several ways you can support the show if you're able to. The podcast is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so any help is greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can support me on Patreon, make a one-off donation via PayPal, or buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com. You can find all the links in the show notes. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandran.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.